writes very difficult symbolistic stories. I do not understand them. Some people claim they do. The critics were frustrated because it was very dense. They thought it was a little vermischt, verwolkend, that he had very cloudy ideas and nobody really understood what was going on, but they loved the language. They knew there was something there, and they kept at it and trying to figure out what he was all about. To publish the second book, Hecha von der Erd, in Warsaw, he meets Yud-Lamed Peretz and falls in love with him because obviously Yud-Lamed Peretz was drawing on Hasidic stories at the time, on Hasidic lore, to get across his socialist ideals. Der Nister worshipped at his feet. It was not requited love, you could say, because Peretz did not really know what to make of this man. He knew there was talent, but it was a little bit too verblonget for him. And the official version is that it was a really wonderful teacher and disciple relationship, but there's a letter by Der Nister to Shmuel Niger, one of the great literary critics, and actually really the only one who kept the letters by Der Nister, in which Der Nister sounds rather disappointed about Peretz's response to him. He publishes his third work, Gesang und Gebet, song and prayer, in Kiev now already, and that also is a very difficult, a very difficult collection of symbolic stories. I actually found a title page von Hecha von der Erd, Above the World, so you can see it's very symbolistic. It's a little bit of decadence there, sort of very reminiscent of the Russian poetry that we have at that time. And in fact, Alexander Blok was a great influence on Der Nister's prose poetry, we would say. It's not really poetry, but it is very, very dense prose. In 1912, Der Nister marries for the first time. He has 2 marriages eventually. I do not know, I could not find out what happened to the first wife. I do know once he gets arrested, he's married to the second wife already, but at that point, he marries a teacher in Zhytomyr, Rachel Silberberg, Rachel Silberberg, why am I calling her, because my daughter Rachel, and they have a daughter, Hodel, Udel, the best, remember, Baal Shem Tov's daughter is called Hodel, so Hodel, right here, and her fate, as you know, is tragic. She dies of starvation in the siege of Leningrad in 1942, which is acknowledged really at the beginning of volume 2 of our book, The Family Mashper. Der Nister felt very isolated literarily in Zhytomyr, and very early on sought contact to a group of writers in Kiev, to that group. We talked about that group already in another course. David Bergelsson, David Hofstein, and Leib Kvitko were part of this avant-garde literary group in Kiev, which produced sort of the first really great prose works. One of their Bergelsson's first novel, decadent novel, was produced in 1908. Came out of that Kiev group, thinking about new ways in which you can use Yiddish and in which you can produce a more realistic form, but at the same time symbolistic form of writing. And Der Nister sort of fits right in. It's about 90 miles from Kiev, so it was actually quite a schlep in those days. He begins with his exposure to that group in Kiev. He begins a new phase of his symbolistic writing, which is even more difficult, and that lasts to about 1929. It begins with this very famous story, Die Meise mit der Nosion at Zikala, became that story, that title came later. As World War I erupts, he finds employment in the timber industry, so everybody had to do something. And he was very lucky to get exempted from military service. He got the Weiße Zettel, the Weiße Quittel, which was a very coveted piece of white paper. Sorry about that. To get exempted from military service. He finds it very difficult to publish during that time. He earns money translating Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, which are if you know them, they're very tearful. I can barely read them. They are about poor people. They're very moving fairy tales. But he also translates and is very good at that. Tolstoy, Turgenev, Grigoriev, Zola, and Anatole France. So he has a hankering, it's very surprising, for realistic fiction, for tremendous 19th century realistic fiction, even though he himself does not write that. So he translates these works from French into Yiddish and from Russian into Yiddish. I'm actually wondering if he didn't really translate Zola from Russian into Yiddish. I'm not sure really how good his French was, but it might have been good. And he begins in about 1918, very famous for him. He begins to write works for children, fairy tales for children, and they are illustrated by Marc Chagall, with whom he is friends at that time. He lives in Kiev in the vicinity during the outbreak of the revolution, which of course, as you know, came with tremendous pogroms in the Ukraine in 1919. So he lives through all of that in the Kiev area, all at the same time staying involved with the Kiev group and believing that Yiddish should continue to appeal to the intellect. He continues to write a symbolistic story as the mass slaughter is going on all around him. It's almost as if it doesn't touch him. It's almost as if the revolution has no bearing on what he is doing as a writer. He stays involved in this world of redemption, of sin, of waiting for a messianic solution to the problems of the world, and he writes about this in intense symbolistic fashion, inspired in part by Rabbi Nachman of Bratslaw's stories. He becomes involved. He's very good friends with David Bergelson, and they run a magazine, which when you find a copy is about like $5,000-$6,000 now. There was one on eBay the other day for $3,500. It was the only time I've ever seen this magazine, Agans. There's 2 volumes of that, and that really defines the new symbolistic writing that can be done in Yiddish. It is an astonishing feat, because only in 1864, we are only really 40 years away from the first time Yiddish was written ever in a story in Das kleine Menschele by Abramovich, a story about a failed education. The very first time it published in 1864. So we have 40 years on, and at that point, or almost 50 years on, and at that point we get very sophisticated symbolistic work in a highly stylized form of Yiddish, which is really an extraordinary achievement at that time. So at that point, he works on Agans, he works with Chagall, he produces children's literature, and in 1920, when the starvation and the killing and the misery is too strong, he moves to Moscow and gets involved in the Moscow artist group, and of course Chagall also moves there, and they move together to the orphanage of Malachovka, which is near Moscow, and they stay there. Chagall is there, and Danista is there, and several other artists are there, and they have these advanced notions of educating kids, advanced notions of pedagogy. There's starvation in Moscow also, so he moves to Kovno, to Kaunas, where his brother Motl, the one who becomes Max Kahanovich, is still there, and starvation is so extraordinary that his brother Motl almost dies. So he knows, Danista knows, there's no place, he can't go back to Kiev, he can't stay in Moscow because the starvation is extraordinary and there's no way to earn a living, and he can't stay with his brother Motl. So he does the next best thing, which we already know from Kulbach. He moves to Berlin, where his son Joseph is born, and he becomes involved with the Yiddish writers group, and they live in the Romanische Café. You will sort of remember when we talked about this, when we talked about Moshe Kulbach, who is there, and they produce an extraordinary journal. It's called Milgräum. It's a large format journal. It's dedicated to a combination of literature and the arts with lavish illustrations, and each of these journals appears in 2 versions. The entire journal gets published 2 times, once in Hebrew and once in Yiddish, and it becomes an extraordinary, really an extraordinary event. However, Bergelsson and Der Nister, who are the literary editors on that journal, are already very much under pressure from the Soviets not to get too involved in the liberal arts and in the liberal movement in Berlin. Berlin was an extraordinarily cosmopolitan city at the time. It had anti-Semitism as much as also all the liberal trends. And after 1 year, the two of them resigned because continuing to work on their Milgram, or as it was Rimon, would have endangered their relationship to the rising Soviet Yiddish magazines, especially in Strom, in the river or the stream, which was the rising Yiddish literary magazine in the Soviet Union, and that was really where their money was coming from. They couldn't be living on anything like that, like Milgram in Berlin. So that was where the money was coming from, and there was a notice appeared in Strom saying that we, Bernister and Bergelsson, have resigned from Milgram. We have no longer any association with this magazine. So you can already see, people have been wondering why he returned to the Soviet Union in 1926, but this was not spur of the moment kind of decision. This was something that was well prepared and that had economic reasons rather than ideological reasons. He publishes in Berlin what I would say his magnum opus of symbolistic works. Is a 2-volume story collection. It's called Gedacht, thought about, in 1922 and in 1923, so one volume in each year. And he publishes, actually this story was already written in Malachovka in 1920. He published a messianic story that's called Neigeist, the New Spirit. And it is a praise of the arrival of messianic times, i.e. the revolution in the Soviet Union. And it finishes with a lavish description of a sunrise in the east. So there is no way not to read this as a praise of the revolution. One has to understand this was not written in Berlin. This was written in Malachovka in 1920 when the artists believed that there was a chance that the revolution would work out in the way in which they would love it to work out, as a general release from oppression for all peoples living in the Soviet Union. It was very difficult for the Nister, after he had resigned from Milgram, to continue living in Berlin, because it was clear where his ideological sympathies were. Not so much that, but where he thought that his future would be. And so he moves together with David Hofstein and I think someone else, I think Lake Quitko, to Hamburg and works there for we're now in the new economic policy, so there's some business has been allowed for a Soviet company, import-export company. And then in 1926, he returns, like many other of his colleagues, Yiddish writers, moves back to the Soviet Union, and he settles in Kharkov, where he stays until pretty much until he gets moved to Tashkent. So he reissues then in 1929 as you remember, he publishes 1922, 2023, the volumes Gedacht, and he reissues that volume in 1929 with the right alterations in the Soviet context. He puts a different story in the front and a different story in the back in order to make clear, yes, I do want to continue my symbolist writing, but I am making some concessions to the new ideology in which I am writing. So he reissues Gedacht, his magnum opus of symbolistic stories, and in the Soviet Union, and he follows this up with one more, and this is the last one of his symbolistic collections, Von meine Gitter, from my estates, stories. At that point, actually already beginning in 1927 being the time when the 12 chairs were published, okay, on the humoristic form of what is now happening, 1927, but really in full force in 1929, the attacks on the symbolism begin, because it's already clear that that's a bourgeois form, that's not a form that's being tolerated. We are moving toward 1932, the declaration of the Soviet realism, of the socialist realism, that becomes the official doctrine in 1934, but the decree is really already there in so I have to do something about that. In 1929, it's in the air. In 1932, it becomes articulated. In 1934, it becomes law, this doctrine of Soviet realism. And at that point, he stops writing for quite some time. He does no longer publish symbolistic stories. There's no way to do it. I mean, he gets really viciously attacked. He begins to write journalism, and the journalism he collects later in a volume called Hauptstadt, Capitals, and it's really portraits of Kharkov, Leningrad, and Moscow, and there's several other journalistic pieces that are not of the quality that we will see in the family Mashper, but it is something he needs to make an income, so it's something to live from. At that point, probably in the 1930s, in the mid-1930s, just about the time of Soviet realism, he starts writing a fiction. He starts writing a novel, and it's called Von Fünften Jahr, about the fifth year, and it depicts the 1905 revolution. It gets printed only in 1963 in the Soviet journal Homeland, and it is sort of as I write here, parallels the erotic awakening of protagonists and the arrival of the revolution. It's very flat, and it's very Soviet, and he never finishes it. It never went anywhere. It's not what he can do, and so he realizes that is not something that is happening. But he does want to write, and there is a letter to his brother in Paris, where he's actually asking, you need to send me money because I am on the brink of starvation, and I need to tell you that I can no longer write symbolistic stories because I get hounded for that. So I have started to write a novel, and I think this one is gonna make it. And so we assume that at that point, having discarded Von Fünften Jahr, he has started to write Mishpocha Mashper, which means that the first book would be written sometime between 1934 and 1939, which is when he's published it simultaneously in IKUF, this is the Yiddish Cultural Organization in New York, and actually with a state-of-the-art official Moscow Yiddish publisher, Emes. And that means something in the first volume of Family Mashper must be totally in line with Soviet ideology, because otherwise it wouldn't have been published. They liked what they saw. Okay? I still think it's a very symbolistic work, but they liked what they saw, and so that will be one of our points of discussion. What is it that they saw, and what did they like about that? And how did the Nister, I think, manage to keep his integrity? You know, what was the fine line that he was walking there? So that would be our work for today. Then in 1941, as you know, Soviet Union was invaded by the Germans, breaking the non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, and Nister and his family were very privileged. They got evacuated to Tashkent, and he becomes a member of the anti-fascist, Stooge Anti-Fascist Committee. Those were the guys who were sent out, you know, to America to collect the money to help the Russian war effort, and those were also the guys who later had to pay for that, for having engaged in national activities. And most of those people were beginning in 1948 up to 1952 were killed, with the exception of Ilya Ehrenburg. I really wonders how he actually managed to stay alive. In 1943, because there was, of course, starvation also in Tashkent, he returned to Moscow with the family and writes an absolutely extraordinary collection of stories probably written 1942-43, Korbones, which documents, and he knows this, which documents the early Holocaust in Poland. He knows that because he's been in correspondence, and he's spoken with people who have come from Poland. So he has some idea what's going on, but he never knows, he does not know the full extent of the Holocaust. He does not know that all of the Polish Jews, and later of course also the Russian Jews, would be wiped out. But still, those are extraordinarily affecting stories about the onset of the Shoah in Poland. He writes the second volume, as you know, of Family in Mashper, which gets published only in New York. It's smuggled out, and he's arrested by the NKVD in 1949. It's very famous, you probably read about that. Says, when they come, knock on the door, you remember how this works. When from Mandelstam, they knock in the early morning, and he says to them, I'm glad you have come, I've waited for you. Because he couldn't explain why it was that he would be spared. And he sent, there is an extraordinary book actually about, in his, the file was found of his arrest and what happened to him, and in July, I think July 4th actually, or June 4th, he dies in a hospital of a botched operation or lack of medical care. So that's his life. And we don't know what happened to Meyerl's story. Very likely there was a third volume. And as you remember, in the setup of the transition of the end of volume 2, it's very likely that the third volume would have revolved around Meyerl. Meyerl, as probably should be Meyerl from Meir, but I don't know why Wolf writes him Meyerl, but maybe a different form of dialect. Anyway, I want to show you a few pictures of Berdichev. Even though it's a symbolic fiction, I think it makes sense to have some visuals. So this is Berdichev, and so about 19, I'm going to turn off the lights for just 1 second because those are just pictures, and I will turn it back on. 1905, this church, actually it's a Nikolai Cathedral, still exists. I don't know how many of you actually went on Google Maps to actually really look at the city. Is that an absolutely extraordinary ride through the city? It's stunning. So I actually will show you a picture taken with a screenshot later from that street. So here's another street, Belopolskaya Street, which is now Yevrovskaya Street. You probably went on that too. This is a modern version. This is what it was back then. Belopolskaya Street, now Yevropeyskaya Street. And just around, so this is the same church. You can see it, right? This church, and this is what it looks like. This actually happens to be like a postcard. And here, just around the corner, is this yellow house, is Vasily Grossman's house. This should really be the next book that you should be writing. So here's Vasily Grossman's house, Life and Fate, the absolutely great novel set in Berdichev. Here's another screenshot, and you can see, compared to these other houses here, okay, these Soviet buildings, there are some houses left from 19th century Berdichev, which is what that would have looked like, the center of town. So here is another street of the time, You see one of those houses like which I saw next to Smakhnovka Street, next to Grossman's house. This is where the German military then had its also an old Berdichev house. You see how extraordinarily broad the streets are. It's not like we get the impression when we read the opening chapter of Family Mashper that it would all be so small and it's so tiny and so medieval. But all these streets are very, very generous streets. No, it's astonishing. The houses are big, they're very stately. So this would be the center, in the center of town. It's not medieval and at all the way you would imagine it from the description of the marketplace at all. So this is a scene you would be reminiscent of something that you would know from Dr. Zhivago, the train station with the returning soldiers. And this is what it is like today. So this is Dr. Yanovsky is also the head of the Carmelite monastery. This hasn't been a monastery since 1804 or something like that. So the Carmelite nuns had to leave this monastery, which is really the largest monument in Berdichev. Here's another view of that. was there, has been there since the, I would say, the early 18th century. And it had, or maybe it was even there in the 17th century, it was the one place that had a Hebrew printing press. So the people who wanted to print Hebrew books, of which there are many in Berdice, had to go for a very long time to the basement of the Carmelites nuns and print their books. They had a Hebrew printing press. And the reason why I'm showing you this picture, the next one will be a map of Berdice, okay? So you remember, we're beginning now with the first chapter of Family Mashber, which is a description of the three circles of the city, right? The inner circle, the marketplace, the city proper, where everything happens, where the synagogues are, the third circle with the suburbs where the poor people live, right? So you have that, okay? What is the next move in that chapter? What happens next? So you have the opening of the three circles of the city. This is a book. I'm going to put the lights on in a second. I'm just going to leave that for one moment because when I go to the map, you can. This is open book exam, guys. You can use your books. Okay. I'm looking at the first chapter. What happens in the first chapter? What is the setup of this book? Okay. So there are two. There are two things that happen. So the first thing that we get, okay, we get the three circles of the city. What's your next move? This is a book about movement. This is a book about dynamics, the contrast between movement and being static. Movement and being static. When you have a description like that a city consists of three circles, when you have three circles, nothing moves. Except, of course, you have movement in the inside of that inner circle, because that's all about, Friedrich Engels would be very happy in this book, Manchester and the Working Class from 1848. That is the exchange. In the city, inside the innermost circle of that city, everything happens. That is where everything comes together and everything moves, and goods and services and everything is exchanged. And the inside, the movement in the innermost circle, the marketplace, that keeps things alive, right? That just keeps things going. And when nothing is happening in the inner circle, that leads to Moshe's downfall. When the market dies, because there was a drought and for all the other reasons that we'll be talking about in a moment, when there is no movement in the inside, the city is dead. Okay? So that is one dynamic we know. Money makes the world go on, which makes you sort of think about, what was it that the Ennis saw in this novel? This is a novel about the power of money. And nothing else but the power of money. So you got to think about, where does Lucy come in with this, okay? So I'm throwing this out. So what is the second move that is happening in chapter 1? Maybe I need to put on the light that you can study your books.
The synagogues.
Yeah, okay. The synagogue. So we have the second, let's leave out the second, there are all the synagogues in here, okay? So right, in the second circle we got society. In the inner circle we got the market. That's where the money goes. In the next circle we got God and we got the people. Good, that's society. Society. Okay, and then the outer circle we got the dregs. We got the people who are victims of all of that. We got all the people who are the poor. If you know that book, Manchester and the, I'm sorry to mention Manchester, it's like, oh gosh, and the English Working Class of 1848, okay, but where Engels, Friedrich Engels, takes Manchester as an example of what capitalism is. He describes, it's astonishing, he describes the structure of Manchester in exactly the same way in which Janister describes Berdice. The center is where exchange happens. Exchange keeps things rolling. Good. That's one. Okay, what's your second move in that big chapter? What's happening in that chapter? Chapter, the town. Maybe it's happening in the second chapter? Come on, Moshe. What's with the Moshe?
So when it goes to the graveyard?
Yeah. Okay, we got a second move. We got a second move, okay? We got the first move is observing the city, which is very static, even if the center of the inside is bustling. But you know, this is a very static thing. The next thing that is happening is that our guy, Moshe, does something.
He buys
Gets
his
his cemetery plot.
He goes, yeah, he does two things. He buys something and he buys two things. He buys his shroud, okay, and he buys a grave. Why? Why does he do that?
He's had this dream that something bad.
He had a dream. What is the kind of dream? What triggers him that he does that?
He has a dream about the Poles, as I remember.
He has a
Polish
dream. The dream
nobility.
is about something very specific, I think. Let me get my notes. It's about something very specific. Namely, someone's coming to town. Santa is coming to town. His brother, okay? The moment, okay, he gets a letter from his brother, and the brother says, hey, join the Bratzlovers, and I'm coming. Something like that. It could be in a different order, but it's the same thing. Okay, the brother comes, and he has a dream, and in his dream, he has a premonition of his death. Correct? Has a premonition of his death, and he acts on this premonition of his death, and he says, okay, it's okay. I'm going to go buy these grave clothes, and I'm going to go buy the grave. And now, and this is why this is important, now we get something absolutely extraordinary. We get a walk through the city. And the walk through the city, you remember, this book is written in Kharkov. And it is set in 1870. And I just showed you pictures of the city. And when you go, like David did, right, on Google Maps, and you follow it, it is astonishing. You can follow this path to the graveyard because nothing has changed. Because this is a very static city. Holocaust and whatever happened, and Soviet, whatever happened, you can follow that guy's path. And here is how he goes. Huh?
So the weeds are higher in the cemetery.
Yeah, well, duh. Okay, and here's how he goes. Okay, so this is a map of Berdichev, okay? Sort of like this is a screenshot from Google Maps. It's just the inner part. This is the Gnilopyat. This is the river. This is the Carmelite monastery I just showed you. Okay, this thing. You see it's on a green thing on a river, and there's a street right next to it. Okay, that street actually crosses this river. This is the same river that Sandel and Benjamin are going boating on. Okay, this is the Stink River. Say this is the Glubsk is Berdichev. The Stink River is, and he says, oh, the Sandel says, oh, it has like a lake kind of thing. So here's your lake kind of thing. Okay, so now our guy always has to cross a bridge to go into the city. Isn't that interesting? Bridges are never just bridges with their stuff. It's a symbolic thing. He lives outside the city, okay? But it's not really outside the city. So he lives around here. Here, by the way, so he lives in this section because he goes across, not where the monastery is, but he goes across this one. This is Krasnaya Street. And right here, incidentally, is a synagogue built in the 19th century. That was definitely there in 1877. Did you look at that one? On Zagreb Street. It's a blue and white kind of sin building. They just restored it. So he goes from here, he crosses, okay? He then goes up on what is called Zhytomyrska Street. And this here, this modern part, that was the old marketplace. And this is described precisely, very, very exactly. So crosses the river, goes up here. This is the old Bielopolska Street, goes up Zhytomyrska, and Zhytomyrska goes all the way, ever straight. It goes straight, 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 follow Zhytomyrska all the way up. This is one of the houses on Krasnaya Street, which is very, would be one of the houses that he would have passed. Here's the synagogue that he would have passed. And as he comes up on Zhytomyrska Street, here it is, Here is the old cemetery. This is the railway. It describes the railway tracks he has to cross, right? The railroad tracks. That was the end of the town, and just outside that, here is the old cemetery with the grave of Yitzchak, Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. That would be the old. And that is also where Sruli, lies down and throws up and gets drunk and all of that. And here's this. Okay. And that is Levi Yitzchak's grave where everybody goes down. And we are at the point where we can look at the structure of the book and what this book is all about. So astonishing. There are some astonishing things in this book. One of them is the realism of it. That you can take this book and you can go on Google Maps and you can follow and you can see what this was really like. And really an astounding recall. There are other realistic elements in that which are very surprising. For example, what struck you? What is really, if you're thinking about what was said about Abramovich, it was said about Abramovich's novel, if everything would disappear from 19th century Jewish literature, and we only had, or anything 19th century, Eastern European Jewish, and we only had Abramovich's novels, we could reconstruct, what David Frischman said, the world of 19th century Eastern European Jews from his books. That was said about Abramovich. I think we could say that about that book too. Why is that? What struck you about that? What's realistic about that? What was so astonishing?
It was like a slice of life of what was going on in the town and how people were reacting to the changes when the drought comes after the
Right.
fair. All of a sudden, the whole culture changed, and
Right.
people became much more desperate, and that's when the factionalism started taking